The scent of mugwort, sharp and bitter, clung to the humid air in the cramped back room, a counterpoint to the metallic tang of fear that Sachi could taste on her own tongue. Rain, a persistent, mournful drizzle typical of the 5th month in Edo, drummed a monotonous rhythm against the paper of the shoji screen, blurring the already dim light from the single flickering oil lamp. The young woman on the thin futon, Fumi, whimpered, her knuckles bone-white where she clutched a damp, twisted cloth. She was barely more than a girl, her face, usually plump and rosy from her work in her father's bustling noodle shop, now pale and slick with a terrified sweat. "Breathe, child," Sachi murmured, her voice deliberately low and even, a strange island of calm in the fetid, charged air of the tiny, windowless space. The room smelled of cheap lamp oil, stale tatami, and the girl's raw fear. "As I showed you. Slowly now. In. And out." Fumi tried, a ragged, hitching gasp escaping her lips. Her eyes, wide and dark as polished river stones in the wavering light, were fixed on Sachi's face, searching desperately for an anchor in her sea of terror. Sachi offered none outwardly, her expression schooled into an impassive mask, her focus entirely on the delicate, dangerous task at hand. Compassion, she had learned long ago, was a luxury she could ill afford, a dangerous ember that threatened to reignite fires she had fought with every fiber of her being to bank, to bury deep beneath layers of scar tissue and grim necessity. Yet, her fingers, as they moved with precision and a knowledge born of sorrow, were not unkind. They were steady, sure, a stark contrast to the trembling of the girl beneath them. This was her world now, the one she had carved out of the wreckage of another life, the hushed, desperate whispers in shadowed alleyways, the furtive knocks on her flimsy door at ungodly hours. The secret, shameful burdens of women trapped by circumstance, by their own betraying bodies. Sachi, the shadow midwife, the purveyor of a relief that the shogun's law and the judgment of society vehemently condemned. She moved through the teeming, indifferent underbelly of Edo like a phantom, her existence a carefully constructed, fiercely guarded defense against a past that still clawed at the edges of her sleep. Its ghostly fingers seeking to drag her back into its silken, suffocating embrace. The procedure was proving more difficult than she had anticipated. The girl, Fumi, was further along than she had admitted, or perhaps, in her youthful ignorance and terror, had even truly known. Sachi's brow, usually smooth, furrowed in concentration, each minute movement precise, informed by a grim, intimate knowledge gleaned from hushed, desperate teachings in forgotten rooms and, more potently, from her own bitter, searing experience. A faint scar, a pale silver line almost invisible against the weathered skin of her left forearm, throbbed with a phantom ache, a memento usually kept hidden beneath the loose sleeve of her plain, indigo-dyed cotton kimono. Tonight, with her sleeves tied back securely for work, it was starkly visible in the lamplight, a silent testament to a different kind of desperation. A lifetime ago, in a world painted with false gold and real pain. A lifetime when she had been Hana, the prized, tragic flower of the Asagiri house in Yoshiwara, her body not her own, her choices fleeting illusions, her laughter a practiced currency. The memory, sharp and unwelcome as a needle pricked at her, the cloying sweetness of expensive incense designed to mask the scent of despair, the rustle of silk kimonos worth more than a peasant's yearly earnings, the cold, calculating gaze in her Oya's eyes when assessing a girl's worth, or her ruin. And then, the terror, identical to Fumi's now. That had gripped her, Hana, when her own monthly moon had failed to appear. A small, internal betrayal that promised catastrophic external consequences. Sachi ruthlessly pushed the thought away, anchoring herself to the present, to the trembling girl on the futon, to the delicate, dangerous balance she maintained in her life. One mistake, one careless word overheard, one unlucky coincidence, and her carefully constructed anonymity, her fragile safety, would shatter like cheap porcelain. And that Dacian, Ruji, with his sharp, knowing eyes and the slight, predatory smirk that never quite reached them, was always sniffing around the edges of these poorer districts. A carrion bird circling. Finally, with a skill that belied the crudeness of her surroundings, it was done. The tension in the small room, so thick moments before that Sachi felt she could have cut it with one of her sharpened bamboo implements, eased fractionally. Fumi was weeping openly now, great, gulping sobs born of a maelstrom of pain and profound, exhausted relief. Sachi cleaned her few, well-cared-for instruments with meticulous care, her movements economical, precise. She prepared a soothing, warming brew of herbs for the girl, ginger, cinnamon bark, a touch of peony root, her instructions for recovery terse but clear. Delivered in that same low, even voice. The small, surprisingly heavy pouch of coins Fumi's distraught mother had pressed into her hand earlier, wrapped in a piece of worn cloth, felt like a brand against Sachi's skin. Never enough for the monumental risk, yet essential for Sachi's continued, solitary survival. Rest now, Sachi said, her voice still low, almost a breath. It is over. But you must be careful. Very careful. For many days. She helped Fumi sip the brew, then adjusted the thin blanket over her. She slipped out of the small, stifling house as unobtrusively as she had entered, a shadow detaching itself from deeper shadows. The rain had momentarily stopped. But the air was still thick with moisture, carrying the myriad scents of Edo at night, damp earth, rotting wood, the distant aroma of grilling fish from a late-night stall. The ever-present faint miasma from the canals. The mist swirled around her ankles, cool against her skin, washing away some of the room's clinging scent of fear and blood, but not the weight of its secrets, not the residue of Fumi's pain, which now clung to Sachi like a second skin. Her own dwelling, a small, single-rented room at the back of a crowded, dilapidated tenement building overlooking a stagnant, refuse-choked canal in the Fukagawa district, offered little comfort but the profound solace of solitude. Inside, she methodically washed her hands again, and then again, the coarse, lye-based soap doing little to erase the feeling that the suffering of Edo's women was an indelible stain, a pervasive miasma that permeated the very fabric of the city, a silent, unseen river of sorrow flowing ceaselessly beneath its bustling, indifferent facade. She caught her reflection in the small, cracked, and age-tarnished bronze mirror she kept on a low shelf, a woman in her late 30s, her face etched with a weariness that went far beyond her years, her dark eyes holding shadows that the meager lamplight could not dispel. Fortune, her chosen name Sachi ironically proclaimed. She had found none, not in the way the world understood it. Only a grim, relentless purpose, born from the ashes of a former self. A few days later, the persistent early summer rain, the tsuyu, had finally given way to a fragile, humid sunshine that steamed the dampness from the wooden houses and cobbled alleyways. Sachi was tending the small, tenacious collection of herbs she cultivated in chipped clay pots on her narrow, rickety balcony, shiso, decutami, a few struggling stalks of mugwort, when a hesitant shadow fell across her open doorway. Such shadows were not uncommon at her threshold, harbingers of whispered requests and desperate bargains. But this one felt different, younger, more fragile, imbued with a particular kind of fear. She recognized instantly, a scent memory that tightened her chest. The girl who stood there, silhouetted against the brighter light of the alley, was Kinu. Silk. The name, Sachi thought with a pang of bitter recognition, was tragically apt for the way her cheap but surprisingly vibrant, flower-patterned kimono clung to her slender, almost childlike frame, the way her dark, glossy hair, simply dressed with a single, unadorned comb, shone even in the relative gloom of Sachi's room. She could not have been more than 17, perhaps younger, her face a delicate porcelain oval. Her eyes wide and luminous, like those of a startled, cornered fawn. But it was the almost imperceptible scent that struck Sachi first, cutting through the usual neighborhood smells of damp wood, pickling vegetables. And the nearby canal, a faint, almost ethereal blend of quality incense, expensive camellia hair oil, and something else. Something sweeter, more cloying, the unmistakable, deeply unsettling perfume of Yoshiwara. Sachi's heart constricted, a sudden, painful clench. Yoshiwara. The great, glittering cage. A place she had vowed, with every shattered piece of her soul, to never directly engage with again. The risk was too great, the memories too raw, the ghosts too numerous. "You are Sachi-san," Kinu's voice was a mere whisper, a breath of sound barely audible above the distant, rhythmic cries of street vendors hawking their wares, grilled eels, sweet potatoes, the morning's meager catch of fish. Sachi merely nodded, her expression carefully unreadable, her body held still. She had learned, through long and bitter practice, that silence often gleaned more information, more truth, than a barrage of questions. Let the fear speak first. Kinu twisted the patterned fabric of her sleeve between trembling fingers. They say you help women. With their troubles. Her gaze, wide and uncertain, flickered around Sachi's sparse, meticulously clean room, taking in the bundles of drying herbs hanging from the low rafters, the heavy stone mortar and pestle on a low table, the worn tatami mats, the air of quiet, almost monastic poverty. This was clearly not the hidden den of some dark sorceress, nor the well-appointed, reassuring chamber of a respected, licensed physician. It was the room of someone who lived on the very edge of things, in the city's deepest shadows. "What kind of troubles, girl?" Sachi asked, her voice neutral, betraying nothing of the sudden turmoil within her. Kinu's luminous eyes filled with tears, great, slow drops that clung to her thick lashes before spilling onto her pale cheeks. She took a hesitant step further into the room, as if crossing an invisible, forbidden threshold into a world she had only heard of in frightened whispers. "My moon. It has not come, Sachi-san," she managed, her voice thick with unshed sobs. 2 turnings now. Nearly 3. She choked back a sob that shook her small frame. "If the Oya. If she finds out. Sachi-san, you must help me. Please. I beg you." Sachi felt a cold dread seep into her bones, chilling her despite the humid warmth of the day. A Yoshiwara girl. The Oya. The words were like malevolent ghosts conjured from her own tormented past, rattling their chains in the sanctuary of her carefully guarded present. Helping a girl from the licensed quarter, a girl still bound by contract and debt, was infinitely more dangerous than aiding a shopkeeper's daughter, or a married woman with a straying husband. The brothel owners, the Oya, had eyes and ears everywhere, their power within those gilded, paper-walled cages absolute. And discovery, for Sachi, would not just mean arrest and imprisonment by the shogun's officials. It could mean being dragged back to Yoshiwara herself, to face a vengeance far more personal, far more cruel. It could mean a slow, agonizing death, or a fate even worse. She studied Kinu more closely. The girl was undeniably lovely, in that fragile, ephemeral way that Yoshiwara both cultivated and consumed. There was an intelligence in her wide eyes, too, Sachi noted, a flicker of an unbent spirit not yet entirely extinguished by the soul-crushing realities of her life. And in that fragile beauty, in that nascent, terrified intelligence, Sachi saw herself, all those years ago, Hana, young, terrified, utterly alone, with nowhere to turn, no one to trust. The ember of compassion, so long suppressed, so fiercely guarded, stirred, a painful warmth spreading through her chest. "Helping is a dangerous word, child," Sachi said, her voice softer now, rougher than she intended. "What they say I do. It is not without great, terrible risk. For both of us. More for me, perhaps, than for you. I know, Kinu whispered, tears now streaming freely down her face, leaving glistening tracks on her powdered skin. I know. But I have nowhere else to go. No one to turn to. They say you are the only one who understands, the only one who can. She could not finish the sentence, her voice dissolving into a choked sob. Sachi turned away from the raw display of Kinu's despair, busying herself with rearranging a bundle of dried dichotomy leaves, the familiar papery texture a small, inadequate comfort. The irony was a bitter, corrosive thing in her mouth. She, Sachi, formerly Hannah, who had clawed her way out of that perfumed hell, was now being asked to reach back into its poisonous fringes, to risk everything she had painstakingly built. And for what? To merely prolong another girl's inevitable suffering in a system designed to break her, body and soul, or to offer a fleeting moment of desperate relief, a brief, dangerous stay against an almost certain ruin. Was it an act of mercy? Or a deeper complicity in a cycle of despair? Come back in 3 days, Sachi said finally, her back still to Kinu, her voice flat, giving nothing away. At dusk. Use the back alley, the one by the cooper's shop. And speak to no one of this. Not a single soul. Do you understand? No one. Kinu gasped, a small, sharp sound of fragile, incredulous hope. Then you will. Sachi-san, you will help me. I will see you, Sachi interrupted, turning slightly, her expression unreadable. That is all I promise for now. After Kinu had gone, a fleeting splash of vibrant, incongruous color disappearing into the drab, shadowed alleyway, Sachi sat for a long, motionless time on the worn tatami, the faint, disturbing scent of Yoshiwara, of jasmine, camellia oil, and a subtle, underlying sweetness of something akin to rotting fruit, clinging to her senses, a ghostly miasma. She felt the old scar on her forearm throb, a dull, persistent ache. She had made no promises, not truly. Yet she knew, with a sinking, bone-deep certainty, that she was already entangled. The river of sorrow, as old woman Ito would call it, had a strong, insidious current, and it was threatening to pull her back into its deepest, most treacherous depths. The decision, she knew, had already been made the moment Kinu's terrified eyes had met hers. The following days were steeped in an undercurrent of heightened anxiety, a familiar companion Sachi had learned to live with, but one that now felt sharper, more insistent. She went about her usual routines, visiting the early morning markets for fresh vegetables and the occasional piece of fish, delivering her innocuous herbal remedies for coughs and fevers to the neighborhood women who trusted her discretion, tending her small, vital garden of medicinal plants, her face a carefully maintained mask of calm, almost serene detachment. But beneath the surface, her senses were stretched taut, every nerve ending alive to the subtle shifts in the atmosphere around her. Every unfamiliar footstep in the alley behind her tenement, every lingering gaze from a passerby, every unexpected knock on her door, felt like a potential threat, a prelude to exposure. The Daishin, Ruji, had indeed been seen more frequently in the neighborhood, his lean, wiry figure a familiar, unwelcome sight. He had a way of lounging against a wall, seemingly at ease, yet his sharp, restless eyes missed nothing, cataloguing the comings and goings. The furtive exchanges, the subtle signs of lives lived outside the bounds of propriety and law. He was a man who collected whispers, who hoarded secrets, who thrived on the fear he so effortlessly instilled. Sachi knew his type intimately. Edo was full of them, these petty officials who used their sliver of authority like a well-sharpened blade, carving out their own small fiefdoms of power and influence in the city's sprawling, indifferent bureaucracy. His increased presence felt personal, somehow, as if he had caught her scent. She thought constantly of Kinu, of the desperate, fragile hope that had illuminated the girl's terrified eyes. It was a hope Sachi herself had once harbored, a foolish, stubborn belief that escape, or at least survival with some small measure of dignity, was possible even within the gilded walls of Yoshiwara. Yoshiwara, she knew from bitter experience, had a particular, cruel genius for crushing such hopes, for grinding them into the perfumed dust of its endlessly lantern-lit streets. Beneath the weight of silk kimonos and unspoken despair. On the third day, as dusk began to bleed its somber purples and bruised grays into the late afternoon sky, Sachi prepared. She laid out a clean, worn cotton cloth on the tatami, her few meticulously cared for instruments, a slender bamboo probe, a small, sharp obsidian blade, a fine silver needle, arranged neatly beside it. The necessary herbs, carefully measured, were placed in small, lidded ceramic bowls. Each movement was deliberate, precise, a ritual honed by necessity and grim repetition. This was not healing, not in the true sense of restoring life or vitality. This was excision, a careful, dangerous cutting away of a dangerous, unwanted growth, a nascent life that, if allowed to flourish, would bring only ruin and despair to the one who carried it. And likely to the tiny, unwelcome life itself. A soft, almost inaudible scratching at the back entrance, little more than the sound of a stray cat. Sachi opened it a crack to find Kinu, her face a pale, luminous oval in the gathering twilight, her eyes darting nervously up and down the deserted alley. She slipped inside like a wraith, a small, frightened bird seeking refuge from a gathering storm. The scent of Yoshiwara, more pronounced this time, filled Sachi's small room. A ghost of her own past made tangible. Sachi led her to the futon, already laid out. "You are sure of this, Kinu?" she asked, her voice devoid of judgment, a simple, final statement of fact. This was the final threshold, the point of no return. Once this began, there was no turning back for either of them. Kinu nodded, her throat working convulsively. Her hands were clenched so tightly at her sides that her knuckles were white. I have seen what happens, Sachi-san, to the others. The ones who are not careful. Or not lucky." Her voice was barely a whisper. Sachi understood all too well. The hushed, fearful whispers that spread like wildfire through the houses, the sudden, unexplained disappearances of girls who had been blooming with a secret, forbidden life. The girls demoted to the lowest, most degrading ranks, their spirits broken, their eyes hollowed out by shame and despair. She had seen it all. She had lived it. "Lie down, then," Sachi instructed, her voice gentle but firm. She began the examination, her touch clinical yet not ungentle, her fingers palpating Kinu's lower abdomen. Kinu flinched but held still, her breathing shallow and rapid. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by Kinu's ragged breaths and the distant, muted sounds of the city preparing for night, the clatter of wooden shutters being closed, the faint call of a tofu seller, the mournful cry of a night heron from the direction of the canal. Yes, Kinu was with child. Perhaps 6 weeks, Sachi estimated, maybe a little more. Early enough, if one was skilled. And if the gods, or whatever capricious spirits governed such desperate enterprises, were inclined to be merciful. And if Ruji remained ignorant. Too many ifs. "It can be done," Sachi said quietly, breaking the charged silence. "But the risk. You understand it is great." "I understand," Kinu whispered, her eyes fixed on a stain on the low ceiling. "Whatever it takes, Sachi-san. Anything is better than what awaits me if they find out." "It will take more than you possess in coin, child," Sachi stated, not unkindly, but with a necessary bluntness. The unspoken currency, she knew, was pain, a significant measure of fear, and the constant, corrosive shadow of discovery. You will need certain herbs. Strong ones. I must procure them from a particular source. She explained to Kinu what she needed to do in the interim, how to allay any suspicion, what foods to eat, what to avoid, how to manage the nausea that would soon begin if it had not already. Kinu listened intently, her youthful face etched with a premature, heartbreaking gravity. As Kinu prepared to leave, a small, dark shadow slipping back into the larger darkness of the alley, she hesitated, then reached into the sleeve of her kimono and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden hairpin, shaped like a tiny, delicate bird with spread wings. It was clearly an object of some value, or at least of deep sentimental importance. Its wood worn smooth with much handling. This is all I have of worth. Sachi-san, she said, her voice thick with shame and unshed tears, holding it out on her trembling palm. It was my mother's. Before she sold me. Sachi looked at the hairpin. It was a beautiful, poignant thing, a tiny, fragile bird poised for flight. A piece of a life Kinu was already losing, piece by piece. Sachi felt a sharp, unwelcome ache in her chest, a constricting band of shared sorrow. Keep it, Kinu, Sachi said, her voice rougher than she intended, turning away slightly. Your mother would want you to have it. We will speak of payment when this is done. And you are well. Now go. And be careful. More careful than you have ever been in your life. Kinu looked at her, her luminous eyes swimming with unshed tears, a silent, profound gratitude that Sachi found harder to bear than any accusation, any threat. It was a dangerous thing, gratitude. It forged bonds. And bonds, in Sachi's world, were liabilities. The journey to old woman Ito's dwelling, undertaken 2 days later, was always a trial, a small pilgrimage into a world even more secretive and marginalized than Sachi's own. Ito lived on the very outskirts of Edo, where the sprawling city frayed into a patchwork of neglected rice paddies, overgrown marshland, and dense bamboo groves, a place of perpetual mist and the incessant, melancholic croaking of frogs, far from the purview of most prying city officials. It took Sachi the better part of a morning, first navigating the crowded, bustling streets of Fukagawa, then the progressively thinning and muddier tracks that led towards the Sumida's less traveled northern reaches. She carried a woven basket containing a few common herbal remedies, dried ginger for coughs, plantain leaves for minor wounds, a plausible pretext, should anyone of authority inquire about her purpose in such a remote area. The potent, more dangerous herbs she truly sought from Ito were not for common, everyday ailments. Ito's hut was a ramshackle, solitary affair, leaning precariously against a thicket of wild bamboo as if burdened by the immense weight of the sky, or the secrets it contained. Smoke, thin and gray, curled lazily from a smoke-blackened hole in its weathered, moss-covered thatched roof, carrying the complex, deeply earthy scent of 100 simmering, mysterious concoctions. Ito herself, when she finally appeared in the low doorway after Sachi's discreet call, was as weathered and gnarled as an ancient, windswept plum tree. Her skin the color and texture of dried leather, her small, black eyes like chips of obsidian, missing nothing, revealing nothing. You, Ito grunted, by way of greeting, her voice a dry, rasping sound like stones grinding together. She squinted at Sachi from beneath a tangle of grizzled gray hair. Back again. The city's shadows are restless, it seems. Or perhaps, just hungry. Sachi offered a slight, respectful bow. Ito-sama. I have need of your particular skill, and your discretion. My skill is in listening to the earth, girl, Ito said, her sharp gaze unwavering. The earth does not lie. Unlike city folk, with their painted faces and silken words. She gestured curtly with a calloused, herb-stained hand for Sachi to enter. The interior of the hut was even darker than the Fukagawa alleys, cluttered from floor to low rafters with drying herbs. Bundles of strange roots, animal bones, oddly shaped stones, and various unidentifiable implements of her craft. The air was thick, almost suffocating, with their combined, pungent aromas, a potent, heady brew that spoke of ancient knowledge and powerful, untamed forces. Sachi, her voice low and precise, named the herbs she needed, the strong ones, the dangerous ones, the ones that whispered of endings, of blood, of moons forcibly recalled. Mugwort, of course, a common enough abortifacient, but also the rarer, more potent safflower, known for its violent efficacy, and a particular type of licorice root that Ito was rumored to cultivate, said to be dangerously effective when prepared in a specific, secret way. Ito watched her, her head tilted like an ancient, observant bird. Another desperate girl, is it, one from the glittering cages of Yoshiwara. Perhaps, they always have the most complicated troubles. Sachi did not flinch under the old woman's knowing gaze. Desperation has many faces, Ito-sama. And wears many kimonos. Indeed. Ito turned to rummage through her countless bundles, her movements surprisingly agile for her age. This path you walk, Sachi. The one you have chosen, or perhaps the one that has chosen you. It is a hungry one. It consumes those who tread it. I have seen it, many times. I walk it with my eyes open, Ito-sama, Sachi replied, her voice even, though a shiver traced its way down her spine. Ito cackled then, a dry, rasping, humorless sound. Open eyes see the abyss all the clearer, girl. This licorice root you seek. She paused, holding up a gnarled, dark brown root. It will scour a wound clean, yes. But it can also curdle the blood, or twist the spirit. If the hand that measures it is unsteady, or if the soul of the one who takes it is already frayed beyond mending. She wrapped it carefully in a piece of dried bamboo leaf and handed it to Sachi. The safflower, too. Use it with respect. It calls forth the red tide, as you know. But a tide, once summoned, can drown even the strongest swimmer if care is not taken. Sachi accepted the herbs, the weight of their volatile power familiar, unsettling in her hand. She offered Ito a string of coins, which the old woman accepted without comment, her obsidian eyes glinting briefly as she tucked them into a hidden fold of her ragged, earth-stained obi. There is a Daishin, Sachi said, her voice even lower now, a mere breath in the herb-laden air, new to my district. His name is Ruji. He has a keen nose for irregularities. He watches. Ito grunted again, a sound of weary resignation. They all do. Like hungry dogs sniffing for buried truffles, or wolves circling a wounded deer. He will tire of your particular scent eventually. Or find a juicier, easier morsel to torment. Or, you will make a mistake, Sachi. One small mistake is all it takes. She looked directly at Sachi then, her ancient eyes holding a flicker of something that might have been pity, or perhaps just a profound, weary understanding. The river of sorrow has many unseen currents, child. Many treacherous whirlpools. Be sure you are not swept away by one you did not foresee. In your haste to save another from drowning. The old woman's ominous words, heavy with a wisdom born of long, solitary years spent listening to the earth's oldest secrets, echoed in Sachi's mind with unnerving clarity as she made her slow, careful way back towards the teeming, indifferent heart of the city. A wounded deer. That was what Kinu was, young and terrified. And Sachi, perhaps, the foolish, aging doe trying to lead the hungry wolf away, risking her own hide in the process. Ruji's unwelcome presence in her neighborhood did indeed intensify in the days that followed Sachi's visit to Ito. He seemed to materialize at the most inopportune moments, his lean, wiry figure lounging with deceptive casualness against a wall at the end of her alley, or pausing to buy a cheap rice ball from a vendor just opposite her tenement. His sharp, suspicious eyes missing nothing, cataloging every furtive movement, every hushed conversation. He stopped Sachi one late afternoon as she returned from the market. Her basket laden not with herbs, but with daikon radishes and a small bundle of dried fish. "Sachi-san," he said, his voice deceptively mild, almost pleasant, yet with an underlying edge of steel that Sachi recognized instantly. "You are a woman of many quiet skills, I hear from the neighborhood gossips." Sachi inclined her head respectfully, her market basket held steady before her, her expression carefully neutral. "I know a little of common herbs, Dashin-sama," she replied. Her voice calm. "For children's coughs. For old women's fevers. Simple, everyday things that ease suffering." "Simple things," Ruji mused, tapping a long, slender finger against his clean-shaven chin. His own kimono was of good quality, dark and sober, impeccably clean, a subtle assertion of his status. "And yet, some whispers suggest you offer comfort for deeper, more hidden troubles. Women's troubles, shall we say?" His gaze was sharp, probing, trying to pierce the veil of her composure. "Such hidden comfort, Sachi-san, can be a very dangerous commodity to trade in. Grief is a common ailment in these parts, Dashin-sama," Sachi replied, her voice steady, meeting his gaze without wavering, though the old scar on her arm seemed to burn with a sudden intense heat beneath the fabric of her sleeve. "And loss. Sometimes a listening ear, a kind word, is the best medicine one can offer." Ruji smiled then, a thin, humorless stretching of his lips that did not reach his cold, watchful eyes. "A listening ear. Yes. And what fascinating, illicit secrets do those carefully listening ears happen to hear, I wonder?" In the quiet desperation of the night, he let the insinuation hang in the humid air between them for a long moment, then nodded curtly, a dismissive gesture. "Be wary, Sachi-san. The shogun's laws have very long, very strong arms. And some secrets, you see, have a most unfortunate way of screaming to be heard. No matter how deeply they are buried." He moved on then, a silent, menacing shadow disappearing down the crowded lane, leaving Sachi with a cold, tight knot of apprehension coiling in her stomach. He knew something. Or, at the very least, he suspected enough to be exceptionally dangerous. The timeline for helping Kinu, already dangerously short, had just become significantly, terrifyingly shorter. The wolf was not just circling. He was testing the fences. When Kinu next came to Sachi's room, her terror was a palpable thing, a raw, naked fear that made her tremble like a trapped sparrow. "Sachi-san, the Oya. She looks at me so strangely now. Her eyes are like chips of ice," Kinu whispered, her voice cracking. "And Sumiko-san, one of the older sisters, the one who always knows everything. She watches me. All the time. I cannot eat. I cannot sleep. I drop things. My hands shake so." Her voice broke completely. "Sachi-san, I think they know. Or they suspect. Sumiko-san even asked me, very casually, if my moon had been irregular." Sachi's heart sank. This was the classic, terrifying pattern. The subtle shift in atmosphere within the house, the pointed, casual questions, the constant, unnerving surveillance from the older, more experienced courtesans who served as the Oya's enforcers. Then would come the inevitable discovery, the interrogation, and the brutal, exemplary punishment. "We must act quickly, Kinu," Sachi said, her mind racing, already discarding her previous, now compromised plans. Her small, secluded room was no longer safe, not with Ruji's shadow lengthening over her neighborhood, not with his pointed, knowing words still echoing in her ears. She needed a new place, somewhere utterly discreet, somewhere no one, not even the most tenacious Dacian, would think to look. Flashbacks, unwelcome and brutally vivid, assailed her with renewed force as she made her hurried, desperate preparations through the night. Hannah, her younger, terrified self, retching in a dark, foul-smelling corner of the Assaghiri brothel, the acrid, burning taste of some foul herbal brew, forced upon her by a grim-faced older woman still raw on her tongue, a desperate, agonizingly failed attempt. The searing, unimaginable pain of another, more violent method. Its horrifying details whispered to her by a desperate, half-mad older courtesan, a method that had only brought on a raging fever, delirium, and even more fear of discovery. And then, clearest of all, the memory of the old, shadowy midwife, her face a mask of impenetrable shadows in the flickering lamplight of a secret back room, her hand surprisingly gentle, who had finally, terrifyingly, blessedly, ended the torment, leaving Hannah bleeding, broken, and weeping, but, impossibly, miraculously, alive. That midwife, Sachi recalled, had vanished from Edo soon after, like smoke on the wind, leaving Hannah with the grim, unspoken, indelible knowledge that such dangerous help existed, but at a terrible, almost unbearable cost. That terrible knowledge, that harrowing experience, had become Sachi's unwelcome burden. And her grim, clandestine vocation. She thought, with a sudden flash of desperate inspiration, of an abandoned, half-forgotten net mender's hut down by the Sumida River, a dilapidated, isolated structure she had stumbled upon once, months ago, while searching for rare riverside herbs. It was half hidden by a dense thicket of reeds and willows, used only by stray cats seeking shelter and the occasional homeless vagrant trying to escape the city's relentless gaze. It was dilapidated, exposed to the elements, reeking of river mud and decay. But it was also far from prying eyes, far from the usual haunts of Ruji and his ilk. It would have to do. There was no other choice left. Tonight, Kinu, Sachi told the terrified girl when she arrived, a ghost in the pre-dawn gloom. Sachi's voice was firm, betraying none of the tremor that ran through her own hands. The icy fear that gripped her own heart. At the hour of the rat, when the city sleeps its deepest sleep. Meet me by the Yanagi Bridge, the one with the weeping willows. Wear your plainest, darkest kimono. And bring a cloak, no matter how warm the night. You must not be recognized. Our lives depend on it. Kina nodded, her eyes wide and dark in the gloom, pools reflecting a mixture of abject fear and a desperate, fragile trust that Sachi felt as a physical weight upon her own shoulders. To trust someone in this treacherous, unforgiving world was a dangerous, often fatal gamble. Sachi prayed, for Kinu's sake, for both their sakes, that this particular gamble would, against all odds, pay off. For her own part, she knew with chilling certainty that the odds were lengthening against them with every passing, precious hour. The river of sorrow, as old woman Ito had so wisely warned, was indeed deep, and its swift, treacherous currents were pulling them both inexorably toward an uncertain, perilous, and likely fatal edge. The hour of the rat, deep into the belly of the night, found Edo shrouded in a damp, clinging river mist that muffled all sounds and blurred the familiar edges of the sleeping, sprawling city into a landscape of charcoal shadows and ghostly gray forms. Sachi, herself a dark shadow moving among even darker shadows, waited with a patience born of long practice beneath the drooping, spectral fronds of the willows at Yanagi Bridge. The Sumida River, wide and dark, flowed silently. Almost invisibly, beside her, a black, silken ribbon reflecting the faint, occluded glimmer of a veiled, indifferent moon. Her senses were stretched taut as a bowstring. Every creak of a distant, unseen boat on the water, every mournful cry of a night bird, every distant dog's sharp bark, a potential harbinger of threat. She carried a small, tightly wrapped bundle beneath her arm, containing her essential instruments and the precious, potent herbs from old woman Ito, protected carefully against the pervasive dampness. Kinu arrived like a moth drawn to a dangerous, flickering flame, her slight figure almost lost within the voluminous folds of a dark, borrowed cloak, her face a pale, strained oval in the gloom. She moved with the desperate, silent urgency of a hunted, terrified animal, her eyes darting nervously into every shadow. "No one saw you leave," Sachi whispered, her voice barely a breath, as Kinu reached her side. Kinu shook her head, her breath catching in her throat, a small, strangled sound. I think not, Sachi-san. I was very careful." They moved quickly then, Sachi leading the way, sticking to the narrowest, unlit back alleys and towpaths, their soft-soled, worn zori making little sound on the damp, uneven earth. Sachi's intimate knowledge of Edo's labyrinthine, unmapped underbelly, a geography of shadows and desperation, served them well. The net mender's hut, when they finally reached it after what felt like an eternity of furtive movement, was even more dilapidated and isolated than Sachi remembered. The air inside thick and heavy with the cloying smell of decay, old river mud, damp, rotting wood, and something else. The faint, lingering, unmistakable scent of previous desperation. Of others who had sought brief, furtive refuge or committed secret, sorrowful acts within its crumbling, reed-thatched walls. Sachi lit a small, carefully shielded oil lamp she had brought, its meager, flickering light casting long, grotesquely dancing shadows that seemed to mock their desperate enterprise. She spread a thick, worn cotton cloth, also from her bundle, on the packed dirt floor. "Lie down now, Kinu. We have little time before the city begins to stir. And less time before the light." The procedure began, a silent, desperate battle waged in the flickering gloom. Kinu, beyond tears now, beyond coherent thought, was rigid with a mixture of unimaginable pain and abject terror, her small, surprisingly strong hands gripping Sachi's arm with a force that Sachi knew would leave bruises. Sachi worked with a focused, almost brutal intensity. Her own past ordeal, her time as Hana, a silent, ghostly, unwelcome presence in the tiny, suffocating hut. The mugwort, the safflower, the potent, dangerous licorice root. She administered them with the grim precision of long, bitter practice, her movements sure and steady despite the tremor of fear that vibrated deep within her own bones. Each shallow, ragged breath Kinu took seemed to echo Sachi's own. All those agonizing years ago, in another dark, secret room. Outside, the sleeping city was beginning to stir, almost imperceptibly at first. The first distant, mournful temple bell tolled, a deep, sonorous sound swallowed by the mist, signaling the slow, reluctant approach of dawn. Sachi knew, with a cold certainty, that they were on borrowed, rapidly expiring time. Ruji, or men like him, the Daishin and their informants. The city's official and unofficial guardians of a harsh, unforgiving morality, would soon be about their business. Suddenly, a new sound intruded, sharp and unwelcome in the pre-dawn stillness, the rhythmic, unmistakable creak of oars on the nearby river, closer, much closer, than it should be. Then, a low, gruff voice, followed by another, indistinct but clearly male. A patrol boat, perhaps, making its early rounds. Or, Sachi's blood ran cold at the thought, Ruji's men, acting on some new information, some fresh suspicion, making an early, unexpected sweep of these forgotten, lawless riverbanks. Kinu stiffened instantly, her eyes flying wide with a fresh, animalistic terror, a small, choked cry escaping her lips. "Sachi-san. What was that?" "Hush, child," Sachi commanded, her voice a low, urgent hiss, though her own heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She strained her ears, her senses screaming. The voices were louder now, rougher, closer. Definitely not a simple river patrol. There was an edge to them, a predatory keenness. The procedure was at its most critical, most dangerous stage. To stop now, to falter, would be disastrous for Kinu, potentially fatal. To continue, with discovery seemingly imminent. Sachi's mind raced, a frantic, desperate calculus of impossible odds and terrible choices. Diversion. She had thought of it, a last, desperate contingency. There was a small, dry pile of discarded fishing nets and dry, brittle reeds in one dusty corner of the hut, highly flammable. A small fire, quickly set, on the riverbank away from their intended escape route, might, just might, draw the men's attention, buy them precious, life-saving minutes. But fire, in these wooden, tinder-dry warrens, was a fickle, treacherous ally, easily growing beyond control, and it would certainly bring more official, unwanted attention later, much later. She glanced at Kinu's face, pale and slick with sweat in the lamplight, her lips bitten raw, her eyes glazed with pain and fear. There was no real choice left, Sachi knew. Only degrees of terrible, unavoidable risk. Hold still, Kinu. Absolutely still, Sachi whispered, her voice preternaturally calm, a strange, icy composure settling over her. Her hands, miraculously, did not tremble as she continued her vital, delicate work on Kinu, her mind simultaneously calculating the terrible risk of the fire, the direction of the slight breeze, the timing. She had to time it perfectly, to the precise second. The voices were almost upon them now, just beyond the hut's flimsy, rotting wooden wall. A gruff laugh, startlingly close. Sachi could hear the distinct scrape of a boat being dragged up onto the muddy bank, mere paces away. In one swift, fluid, desperate movement, even as her hands completed the final, critical step of the procedure for Kinu, Sachi reached for the small tinderbox and the tiny, stoppered oil flask she always carried. For her lamp. With her body shielding the nascent, tiny flame from Kinu's line of sight, from the damp river air, she touched it to the frayed corner of a dry, oil-soaked fishing net she had, subtly, almost unconsciously, positioned in the corner earlier. The net caught with a soft, ominous whoosh, the flames quickly, greedily licking upwards, small and hesitant at first, then growing with alarming, almost explosive speed as they found the pile of dry reeds. Acrid smoke began to fill the small, confined space of the hut. Now, Kinu, we go, now, Sachi urged, her voice sharp with command, helping the weakened, dazed girl to her feet. Kinu was limp, barely able to stand, her eyes unfocused. Shouts erupted outside, sharp and alarmed. Fire, look, over there, by the riverbank, what in the... The men's attention, their voices, were instantly, completely diverted. Just as Sachi had desperately, impossibly prayed. She half carried, half dragged the near insensible Kinu out the hut's crumbling, low back and trance, away from the river, away from the growing commotion and the angry, hungry roar of the spreading flames, plunging into the concealing labyrinth of tall reeds and overgrown, forgotten paths that led, eventually, back towards the city's outermost, poorest fringe. The acrid, choking smell of smoke pursued them like an angry spirit, a counterpoint to the cool, damp morning air. Kinu stumbled repeatedly, sobbing quietly now. A continuous, heartbreaking sound, leaning heavily, almost entirely, on Sachi's smaller frame. Behind them, the shouts grew louder, more organized, as the fire took firm hold, casting an angry, pulsating orange glow against the rapidly paling pre-dawn sky. Ruji's men, if it was indeed them, would be fully occupied for a precious while, battling the blaze, or at least ensuring it did not spread to the nearby shanties. Sachi did not dare look back. She focused every ounce of her remaining strength, every shred of her will, on moving forward, on putting as much distance as humanly possible between themselves and the chaos, the danger, she had so recklessly, so necessarily, unleashed. They found temporary, desperate shelter in the small, dark, earth-floored cellar of a tiny, struggling noodle shop on the very edge of the Fukagawa district, a place owned by a wizened, stooped old woman whose only granddaughter Sachi had once, many months ago, treated for a dangerous, lingering fever, snatching the child back from the brink with her knowledge of herbs and a stubborn refusal to give up. The old woman, her face a mask of profound worry and unspoken questions, asked none aloud, merely nodded her understanding when Sachi appeared at her back door before dawn, supporting the near-collapsing Kinu. She led them wordlessly to the dark, damp, cramped space beneath her shop, offering a thin, worn blanket and a bowl of weak, lukewarm tea. Kinu, pale as death and trembling uncontrollably, finally succumbed to her ordeal and exhaustion, collapsing onto the packed earth floor in a heap. Sachi tended to her as best she could in the near total darkness, staunching the lingering bleeding with cloths the old woman provided, forcing sips of the potent herbal recovery brew she had prepared and managed to save in her bundle. The girl was alive. The immediate, life-threatening crisis had been averted. But the cost, Sachi knew, had been astronomically high. The fire by the river, even if it was dismissed as an accident, would bring official scrutiny, unwelcome questions, to this forgotten, neglected area. And Ruji, Sachi felt with a chilling certainty, was not a man to forget a scent once he had caught it. Not a man to let a promising investigation grow cold. His net, though cleverly, desperately dodged this one time, would undoubtedly be cast again, wider, and with more lethal precision. As the first true light of dawn, gray and unforgiving, filtered through the cellar's single tiny, dirt-encrusted ventilation grate, casting feeble stripes across the damp earth, Kinu stirred. Her eyes, when they slowly focused and met Sachi's in the gloom, were no longer those of a startled, innocent fawn, but of something older, something that had looked into the very abyss of human suffering and had barely, by a thread, crawled back. "Thank you," Kinu whispered, her voice raspy, barely audible. The words were pitifully inadequate, Sachi knew, yet they held a universe of desperate, profound meaning. Sachi merely nodded, her own exhaustion a heavy, leaden weight in her limbs, her soul. There was nothing more to say, nothing that words could encompass. The monumental risk she had taken for Kinu, the fire she had deliberately set, the laws she had so brazenly flouted, these things had irrevocably shifted the precarious, fragile balance of her own carefully hidden, solitary life. When Kinu was strong enough to move, a full day later, her color slowly returning, her bleeding stemmed, Sachi arranged, through a series of discreet, whispered messages passed via the old noodle shop woman, for her to be taken, under cover of deepest night, back to the fringes of Yoshiwara. Not to her old house, which would mean certain discovery and terrible retribution, but to a slightly less notorious, more forgiving establishment in a quieter corner of the district. One run by an older, retired courtesan whom Sachi had known briefly in her own past. A woman who owed Sachi a significant, unspoken favor from a time long ago. It was, Sachi knew, only a temporary reprieve for Kinu, not a true solution, not an escape. Kinu's future remained a dark, uncertain, treacherous path, but at least she would walk it, for now, without the immediate, terrifying threat of this particular ruinous secret. Their parting was brief, conducted in the pre-dawn gloom of another alleyway, laden with unspoken words, with the shared trauma of their ordeal. Kinu, her face still pale but her eyes holding a new, hard-won resilience, pressed the small, intricately carved wooden bird hairpin, her mother's last gift, back into Sachi's calloused hand. "For your courage, Sachi-san," she whispered, her voice stronger now. "And for my life. May it bring you better fortune than it ever brought me, or my mother." This time, Sachi did not refuse the poignant offering. She closed her fingers around its worn, smooth wood. She returned to her own small, empty room in the Fukagawa tenement to find it subtly, chillingly disturbed. Nothing overt, nothing obviously missing or broken. But a chipped teacup was slightly out of its usual place on the low shelf. A floorboard in the narrow entranceway creaked where it had not creaked before. The air held a faint, almost imperceptible scent that was not her own. Ruji. Or his men. They had been here. A silent, menacing message. He knew. Or at the very least. His suspicions about her were now a razor's edge from absolute certainty. Sachi sat in the dim, gray light filtering through her paper shoji, the small wooden hairpin cool and solid in her palm. She had saved Kinu, for now. But in doing so, she had undoubtedly drawn the keen-nosed wolf much, much closer to her own vulnerable door. The city outside, Edo, hummed with its usual, indifferent life, oblivious to, or perhaps willfully ignorant of, the silent, desperate wars waged daily, nightly, in its hidden, shadowed corners. She thought of the fire by the river, a desperate, dangerous act, a beacon of her quiet defiance that could also, very easily, become the signal for her own undoing. In a hidden alcove, behind a loose, cleverly disguised wall panel, Sachi kept a small, makeshift altar. Here, a collection of tiny, crudely fashioned clay figures resided, offerings for the Mizuko, the lost water children, the spirits of those never born, or born only to die in secrecy and sorrow. Among them was one she had made with trembling fingers many years ago, for the child she, as Hannah, had never held, never known, but would never, could never, forget. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 sorrows, she placed Kinu's delicate, carved bird hairpin before it, a silent token for another precious life unlived, another profound sorrow absorbed into the city's endless, unheeding stream of human suffering. The old scar on her arm ached, a familiar, almost comforting companion in her solitude. Her life, she knew, was a perpetual, precarious tightrope walk over an abyss of exposure and ruin. Yet, as she looked at the hairpin, at the small, fragile, yet defiantly poised bird with its exquisitely carved, spread wings, a flicker of something other than her usual profound weariness, her bone-deep cynicism, stirred within her. It was not hope, precisely, certainly not happiness. It was something harder, grittier, more enduring. It was the grim, unyielding, almost defiant strength of survival. The stark, solitary knowledge that, despite everything, despite the ghosts and the fears and the ever-present threats, she was still here. A shadow, perhaps, in a city of shadows, but a shadow with a purpose. A shadow that, in its own small, dangerous way, still fought against the encroaching darkness. The city, Edo, would continue its intricate, often cruel dance of illusion and reality, of beauty and brutality. The river of sorrow, Sachi knew, would continue to flow, deep and silent, beneath its glittering, paper-thin surface. And she, Sachi, the shadow midwife, would continue to walk its perilous, lonely edge, her dangerous skills a desperate, fragile comfort to those who, like her, had been swept, unwillingly, into its darkest, most unforgiving currents. Another knock would come. It always did. And she, Sachi, would answer.